Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here, braving the heat. We're very excited to present Thanasis Ikonomou. Thanasis is an award-winning architect, and he has travelled extensively throughout Greece and Europe and North America. And we asked him to talk a bit generally about the subject of architecture and emotions, how architecture affects us. He's going to give his own perspective, his own unique take on that, his observations and questions about that. So yeah, we're very excited about that. I'll say a few words about Moon Station. It's an initiative to bring creative people, architects, artists, writers together to kind of get to know each other and maybe even collaborate. It was created by Rana Haddad, who's my business partner, and my name is Olympia Zagrafos. I'm an interior designer, and this is my studio, so welcome. And we are self-funded, so if you want to help fund future events, we have a donations box on the table. So that's enough for me.
So I'm very honored to be here tonight and to talk about architecture from the perspective of an emotional connection to a place. What I was thinking to do tonight is talk about my projects from not just when I started my practice, but also talk a little bit about my projects from the past. It's going to be a mix about large projects and small projects, and I want to open up a conversation about the scale. I also want you to think about context really carefully as I'm going through these slides. This image on the screen right now was the very first project I did when I came to Greece. The house was an existing house and we designed a new landscape. So basically what we were doing was taking this very 90s building and contextualizing it. So we didn't change the architecture at all, but we actually changed the way you enter the house. And this was done, this photograph was taken by the photographer DAljousied, who was also responsible for the documentation of the Niarchos Foundation from these aerial photos. And he said something really beautiful. He said, you know, usually I come about an architect who will design an image and then I photograph that image. And for some reason, I go through this project and I keep on finding new things. So it's not one grand image, but it's a collection of small moments. So for me, that really touched me. So I just wanted to introduce my presentation with that project. I also want to talk about my own story as well. I think it wouldn't make sense to talk about an emotional connection to my work without talking about who I am. And I see my life as a series of chapters. I actually began as a biologist, not an architect, and I decided in my mid-20s that I was going to become an architect. It was this dream of mine that I could not imagine I would ever become one. I was a terrible biologist, so in a way I was kind of positioned to look into something new. This is me at 24 years old. And this was a photo shoot that we did for my parents' restaurant. And this was the first project that I project managed as a young pre-designer, let's say. And I fell in, it's near Vancouver in Langley. It's just a town just outside of Vancouver, Canada. And I fell in love with design. And I remember talking to the designers at the time and being like, you know what, I think I want to be an architect. I don't think I'll get into dentist school. I'm a terrible biologist. And she said, thank God, because I did not see you as a dentist.
Or a chef. I mean, it seems pretty good here.
And this restaurant was very influential for me for many reasons. Because even with food, I would experiment and try different things. What was interesting was at the time, before I got into architecture, I said to myself, I want to look into why do buildings look so different today? Why does one thing look so different than the other? I was so obsessed with his image. I didn't really understand architecture all that well. 15 years later, my perspective on architecture changed completely. So I then began to realize that there are multiple senses. We touch things, we smell things, the light. There are multiple things that we're affected by. And also buildings affect us psychologically. So it became less about what you saw, and it became more about what you feel. In 2020, I ended up leaving my job in Seattle, and I took a year off from work. And I wanted to reflect on previous experiences, and also think a little bit about my own agenda. So in my very scientific, biological way, I went out and I created a list of bullet points that I would see from the world, like the way people would talk to me. That's interesting. I would walk down the street and be like, why is it like that? It would be a collage of questions and observations. I got to 129 by the end of the year, and I think, today I'm going to present to you some of these points and try to link them with my projects. Bullet point number 7. If you understand people, you understand architecture. So after this exercise of observing the world, which, I almost became like a sociological experiment. Like the world is this experimentation ground, and I myself am the subject that I position myself into different contexts. And then I would reflect on this list, and I understood that there's different patterns that have emerged. And I realized that our architecture is actually quite simple. Like it's really simple. However, people are very complicated. So architecture inherently becomes complicated because people are complicated. The other thing I realized, which was number 26, was that every space has a story to tell. Whether it's a big space or a small space, there's a message that each space communicates to us. So I started looking into different communities across Europe. I had a drone, I had a camera, and I would start looking at things from far and from zoomed in. This is a traditional Norwegian village just north of Bergen called the Tun. The Tun originally was this area here with a farm in the middle, always next to a river which would provide power. And within, you would have the animals down below, and you would live up above. So there was this interaction between all of the villagers. They would help each other out. And for me, it was an important lesson in the history of communities. Something completely radically different in contemporary societies. This was in Denmark, where they built a ski slope on top of a power plant. Also a very interesting story, but a very contemporary one. In Sweden, I realized that actually, in terms of its agenda, was very similar to the United States, which I didn't know. And this was an old factory just outside of Malmo. Eventually, during that year, I ended up in Greece. This is Ikonomou in Syros, which for me, I fell in love with Greece. I fell in love with the charm, with the scale, with the culture, with the diversity. So many communities in such a small proximity of landscape that for me was just nothing like I've ever seen. Landing in Athens, I started trying to understand what was going on. I was very confused. And when you compare these two communities, you realize that it's actually built the same way. Like it's this architecture that sort of takes over the landscape. The problem is, when you change the scale, you change everything. So the problem is, they took a scale that was in a Greek island and assumed if they just made it bigger and do the exact same thing, it would work. But you cannot do that. When you change the scale, you change everything. This is Vancouver. So this is the city I grew up in and I was born in. I also did my first degree in biology here. And for me, it was also interesting to compare these two cities. Athens was a city that took over the landscape, whereas Vancouver was a city that was placed within the landscape. It is composed of mostly park. This is Stanley Park, which is in the center of the city. It's bound by water on 3 sides, which means that it has nowhere to go but up. Yet, the park land still weaves in and out of architecture. Before I came to Greece, this was the last project I did in my previous practice in Osen Kunde, but also the first project in which I was granted the design lead, was to design a tower up here on the mountain. Vancouver has a datum. This is the highest point you're allowed to build. Anything above that is considered provincial forest, and it's forbidden to build. So we had a very privileged site. Here's another view of Vancouver during the winter, and this is the hills. The ski hills are within a 15-minute, 20-minute bus ride up the mountain. And what we did not want to do was actually take the city building and place it in the mountain. I was quite adamant that a forest building needed, a tower in the forest needed to be a forest building and not a city building. So this was a sketch that I did, and I had just come back from Japan about a week ago and fell in love with the way that the Japanese dealt with large architecture. They were able to compose large pieces of architecture in a very individualistic way. This was a point that my previous boss, Tom Kundig, made, which was nature does a better job of designing than we do. And this is also something really important to consider, because we're so obsessed about overruling nature that we forget that sometimes the best things to do is allow the natural environment to actually push back on the context. This is a 3D visualization of the tower. We cladded it all in copper, and there is this idea that in the back side of the building where there's a lot of moisture, copper starts to go green really quickly. And on the front side where it's exposed to the sunlight, it'll stay brown for a much longer period of time. So all of a sudden you have this building that behaves like a tree trunk and actually morphs into a different identity according to its position with the sunlight. When I went to Norway, I met with the visual artist that did these images. The company was called MIR, and Trond gave me a tour of his studio and talked to me a little bit about how they create these images that are very atmospheric. And he said to me that you cannot force a feeling of a scene. You must embrace the atmosphere you are creating. In other words, what they were doing was they build the landscape first, and then once they learn about the landscape, then they design the building in the we design the building, but they design the image for the building. Here's another image which shows these bridge apartments that overlook the water, and these units that have a living room that have a connection to both three sides. Bullet point number 89. The unique setting of Nova Scotia, with its identity of smallness and frugality, have shaped me as an architect far more than I imagined. My image of communities was no longer just large faceless places, but ones of collective identity. So when I took time off from work, I started realizing that this architecture school that I gone to, which could be, probably is, the most remote architecture school in the world, located on this rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. To give you a perspective, this is where the burial ground for the Titanic is, because it was the closest thing they can get to. It's literally floating in the Atlantic Ocean. But what ends up happening is the people were incredible. They were so friendly. They were untainted from contemporary life. And you learned a lot about the place. Here, we're on the opposite side of Canada, still on the water, but on the Atlantic. And the trees don't grow very tall because of the intense winds. They don't have an opportunity to get very big. Part of the school was my professor, Brian McKay Lyons, that had a ranch. And he would host this lab called Ghost Lab. And Ghost Lab was a workshop in which every summer they would build a building. They would bring in one well-known architect along with inviting other architects to start thinking about craftsmanship and design. This is one of Brian's buildings. And the idea was to create something very contemporary, but something that also referenced the past. So it's not, this training of mine wasn't about not progressing forward, but at the same time it was about being aware of the history as you move forward. To the left is Brian, and he famously said in one of our studios, "You cannot polish a turd," and he's totally right. And it sounds absurd, but it's actually very intelligent. It's very smart. The problem is this tinkering we're doing these days. We're picking ideas that may not be the right idea, and keep on working at them, hoping that with enough polish it'll become incredible. But the problem is we need to think a little bit more intellectually about the ideas that we are about to invest our energy in before actually pushing them so far in the future that it's too late. On the right is one of the guest speakers of one of the Ghost Labs. This is Yohanni Palasma. He's one of the grandfathers, let's say, of this movement that talks about emotional connection to architecture, that we architects called architectural phenomenology. He came up with this book called Eyes of the Skin, and he had this really beautiful quote where he says, "I dwell in the city, and the city dwells in me." In other words, I influence the city, and the city influences me. So it's a back and forth relationship. All right, bullet point number 42. Early in my career, I was fascinated by large buildings, ones that allowed me to design not only buildings, but entirely new atmospheres. When I graduated from architecture school, I was recruited into the Netherlands in this firm that we were challenged to design the headquarters for Europe's largest media house, which is Axel Springer. And the existing building is this slab building, which was built in the 60s. And this was the old trench of the Berlin Wall. The East Berlin on the other side got so upset that West Berlin built their newspaper company overseeing East Berlin, that East Berlin built a series of residential towers to block the views to all of the public spaces on the side. When we were designing this park on the rooftop, we realized that we had no views to any of the significant monuments of Berlin. I thought I was in a great position to figure out how to make big buildings humans. You know, I was with this very incredibly progressive thinker who's a very historical figure in architecture, Rem Koolhaas, who was leading our team, and he was telling us all of these great things, and it would become this playground, and it would be like East Berlin meets West Berlin. It's not a wall anymore, it's a valley, and all of these little small companies would interact with each other, and it's going to become amazing. It's going to be like what Berlin is outside, we're going to replicate this kind of atmosphere inside of this building. And the reality is, after a lot of cost reductions, the atrium gets smaller, the desks become more plentiful, the materials become quite generic, and you start realizing that the world has changed. Observation number 82, spaces are changing from places of self-expression to flexible spaces of unknown future. This moment of time for me was very difficult to come to terms with. That very rich, experientially rich spaces require a very specific function. Once you try to accommodate everyone and make it flexible, it means that the architecture itself has to also become more flexible. In other words, more generic. I had done a grant talking a little bit about the shifting of communities. And I realized that there's this movement called neo-tribalism, in which companies were borrowing or abusing this term tribes and using it as a way to define entities. So in a typical village, you have a collage of people that are specialists, that are all appreciated for what they do, and they kind of work together. And then these villages interlock with one another, so you have an ecosystem of villages. I was seeing a shift where, living in Seattle before coming here, that big companies were creating a very uniform identity for them, and there was an agenda to reinforce this image about who they are to the people themselves and promote this uniform identity over their own personalization. This is Seattle. It's known for the Space Needle. It's also known for music. This is Jimi Hendrix performing live at Key Arena back in the day. It's also known for its bookstores. It's home to, I think, the city with the most bookstores in the United States. It's also a very troubled city. So originally Seattle was designed on this peninsula here and was considered to be too hilly to make it successfully a city. So they ended up taking the city, moving it to its current location. Unfortunately, it was still too hilly. It went to fail for a second time, so they started this Denny regrade project where they ended up leveling the whole city, like unreal. And moving all of the buildings from the top to the bottom. This Denny regrade project began in the 1800s, late 1800s, and went up until the 1930s. So the city was no stranger to reinvention, which meant that when Amazon, Jeff Bezos, decided to form Amazon in Seattle, he was able to convince the city to become what he has become, probably more easier than any other city in the United States. This is contemporary, this is modern day Seattle. I remember being on the phone with a friend of mine in New York during COVID and being like, oh, you know, what's going on in New York? Like, what is it like? And she said, do you remember Seattle? I'm like, yeah. She's like, well, it's like that. So, imagine quarantine New York having the same atmosphere as Seattle before quarantine. Amazon takes up at its height, while I was in Seattle 5 years ago, 20% of the office space. Their agenda is to have people sit on their couch and eat, sleep, everything from their couch, not leave their comfort of their living room. And it's actually one of the few cities where even H&M couldn't actually succeed as a brick and mortar store. Point number 59. We have never lived in a time where we've been tricked into thinking we have so much architectural diversity. When I go out and look at materials for architecture, for buildings, I keep on being bombarded by all of the options I have. You can go steel, you can put mesh, you can put diagonals, you can put wood, you can put hanging corners, you can put red cubes, you can put curves. And I see this image and I feel nothing. Honestly, this image has absolutely every architectural element you can think about that could exist, yet emotionally I feel that looking at it. When I was in the Netherlands, I left the Netherlands thinking I was going to move to Vancouver, I got a call from Olsen Kunding, which was a firm that I studied during architecture school, and they were somehow the resistance. So they were in Seattle, but they had this sort of inspiration from the industrial past of Seattle. This crank here is operated with the pressure of water and opens up this whole skylight with just the lift of a button. So they started this trend of having us to think about hand crank moments. And what ends up happening is you get happy. Like you open a window with your hands and you feel accomplished. It's not like pulling a switch. These are some of the buildings that were coming out of the office. This one here, Chicken Point, is fairly well known, as well as the pier that was built into the rock. I, however, was brought into designing the headquarters for Nike. they said to me, well, we want you to do what you did for Axel Springer, but for Nike. And we want to design their future. Bullet point number 64. Today there is an obsession with a destination, yielding communities that behave like islands. This is the campus of Nike. It's located in Beaverton, Oregon, just outside of Portland. They begun in this town south of Oregon called Eugene by this trainer called Bill Bowerman, that in the 90s then decided to take their shoes more seriously and ended up building these generic buildings that they thought that Nike was a fad. They said, you know what, people love our shoes right now, but in 5 years they're going to get bored of them, so we need to be able to sell our buildings really quickly because we're not going to exist in 10 years' time. That was not the case. They ended up expanding 2 more times, and this is the building that I had spent 5 years of my life before coming to Athens. And what I noticed about that campus was it could be anywhere. It honestly did feel like a spaceship that just landed in the middle of a field. This was our neighboring buildings. There was a marketing agenda to assign a name to every building. This was named after Serena Williams. You cannot tell what this building is. Like, this is the building for the executives, but honestly, it could be anything. There's no indication of what is happening inside. It's actually hiding. So what we wanted to do for our building was not mask what the building was. We were a building that was going to house every single shoe designer and clothing designer in the whole company. So for the first time in history, there would be a collaboration between making shoes, digital technology, and clothing. They had this lab in blue where they would make prototypes. And then in purple here was a big gymnasium that they would test the products as live as they were creating them. I put this slide in here because I liked to show the comparison between scales. So here are the buildings Olsen Kunding was known for, that were kind of in its most inventive moments. Here's a typical office building, and at 206 meters long was the Nike building. And it's not even the largest entity to exist. Above it is Nike, which has even more influence than a building that's 206 meters long. In fact, when you take the building that we designed and pay attention to this little fountain that we have here, you start realizing that that little fountain is actually just as big, if not larger, than one of Athens' biggest public squares. Which had me thinking of point number 5. The scale of ambitions are independent of physical size. Here you have the cabin in the woods from Olsen Kunding, where these panels by a hand crank actually close off the windows. Come on. Here you have the Nike building. Here you have the inside of the Nike building, which the only way to get you to understand how big it was to place people inside of it. And then you have the cabin where, even with the absence of people, you feel more of an emotional connection to it than the bigger building. So I came to Greece, and my list started with bullet point number 1, which was small is beautiful. Once I left my positions in offices, my work became more intimate. I did a series of very experimental artistic projects across different places in Europe. For the Biennale in Venice, in Estonia, I did a workshop, and I also did the sculpture with a friend of mine from Seattle, she was in New York. And we decided to build this cone, and this was in Portugal, in a sculpture park that we won a competition for, where we suspended this birdhouse and created an amplifying device so that, for once, birds were made to appear big, and people were made to appear small. So there was an inversion of scale. It was COVID, so We were all with masks. I had special permission to travel. And this was the giornale head of press that I had to present the project to, and Signy wasn't there because no one in the States was able to travel. And also, we're taught how to make it ourselves. And then the final product is made out of raw steel, and which we wanted it to rust and blend with the environment. And there's a little birdhouse. After doing these little projects that were more artistic, I decided to go back into architecture. The first project was I spent a few months in my ancestral village in Ipiros, which is where my mom and my dad are both from, on the same street. And I volunteered some of my time for us to think about what will the public space of this village be. They've had this property for 10, 20 years. They created a committee, fundraised to purchase this property, and it stayed vacant. And what I wanted to do for that project was not to do something really like outrageous, but actually think about how something quite simple can become strategically smart enough that it can actually impact the community. So we decided to go with a grid that created some rhythm and some cadence. We did these platforms where during a music festival you would put tables on various levels so that you would experience the music even from further back. And we created a staircase for the rooftop so that you had a view over the whole valley. We decided to render it in this rose color. It's the color of like an aristocratic villa, but we thought it would be a nice idea if we actually created a villa for the public. And I spent my first lockdown making this model by hand out of foam, which shows the relationship between the church, which is something like secular, and our pavilion, which is non-secular. And I mean, the priests loved that. They loved that. It was something I did not realize. It was such a sensitive topic in this country. Priests do not want to be, they don't want the church to be included in the same sentence as public space. There's the church and there's everything else. This is the village. It's in this incredible valley with villages across on the other side. Here's the public space that we were designing. And there's a rivalry between. The acoustics are so good, you can hear gossip from the one side to the other. What's that?
What's the name of
It's called Nikolitsi. Behind this ridge is Suli, where historically the women would fall for their own death in favor of offering their bodies to the Ottoman Empire. And I wanted to talk about two more projects. One is an apartment that I did for my family, and one is the space that we have our practice in. They're very small projects, much smaller than some of the other projects that we're doing in the office. But they, for me, were these very beautiful injections into the city that talk a lot about the forgotten culture of Athens and how we can review some of the things and bring appreciation to what the city already has to offer. This apartment looks tiny. All you see from the street is these two little windows. And it unfolds as you go back. It's super deep. And you have one light well, two light wells for the apartment. And when I was approaching this project, I wanted to make sure that I reflected on what made us humans and make sure that the building, although it's a machine for us, we ourselves are not machines. So this is a piece of artwork. It's one of the first pieces of artwork I've ever acquired at this size that talks about this traveling person imagining what Asia is like. And for me, it was a source of inspiration for the apartment. I had the contractors peel back all of the layers and started realizing that there was a lot of interesting textures that I could borrow into the design. The intention for this project is that I myself would do nothing, but would curate this process of removing things that had no relationship to what the building originally was. This is an image of the apartment when I had it. They were embarrassed about these columns, so they decided that it looked more architectural if they painted them, and had furniture that did not match neither the atmosphere nor the scale of the space. During the process, we realized that we had glue from old wallpaper that we decided to keep. And then the electricians, when they dug the walls, also created their own little like Mondrian painting. And we decided that in this case, unlike the other wall where we had a piece of artwork from an artist, 90 degrees from that, it would be the artwork from the contractors themselves. They did not realize they were the artists. And I was trying really hard not to give them direction. I mean, when they splattered this much yellow, I was like, ah, it's too much, but I'm not the artist. So I just let it be. On the opposite wall, there's a theatrical curtain which defines the whole space. And then to the right is the entry to the kitchen where we've added one more window. That interior window looks into an eating area, which in turn looks into the light well, which is very typical for Athenian projects, which in turn looks into my bathroom. So for me, it was kind of like this Hitchcock moment that I got so excited when we made this window. They're just like, it's just a square. Like honestly, couldn't you just put a circle or something? I'm like, no, it has to be a square, because it's a square within a square within a square. And it's those things that are under-stylized, yet somehow provide a lot of character to the space. The kitchen was one of the few places which was more architecturally designed. It's located in the geographical center of the apartment, and I liked the idea of using green, just to reference theater, the green room, the place of preparation. I just thought it was a nice homage to that. And we did this kitchen where we have this marble countertop that is almost like this ribbon that goes from kitchen to sink to counter to laundry room to data center. And then there's a little eating nook that's created here, and this big totemic element with this rotated refrigerator, which was, in the past I used to be really into cars, and I remember these dashboards that used to curve towards the driver, and I'm like, oh my god, this fridge is like super ergonomic, the way it kind of rotates towards the person cooking. And I have to shout out Melissa here for the drawings. She's an incredible illustrator, and she did these drawings for this apartment. This is the existing situation of the kitchen, and this is the new design. Here is the refrigerator, and then from the other view. One thing to keep in mind about these photos, they were all shot in medium format analog film. And the photograph, this came to me and I said, I don't want them to look like a normal photo shoot. He's like, okay, I'll bring in an analog camera, which has a very specific proportion that's normally used for landscapes. And we actually photographed the whole interior project with this camera. And that meant that we were able to get out a lot more detail from some of these areas that in a digital camera would be completely overexposed. So I was happy to know that it wasn't just like a stylistic element, but it actually was a very useful tool. In the backyard, there's this beautiful olive tree, which makes me forget that I'm in the city. Point number 23, how are we doing for time? Am I okay? Yeah, okay. This is the last project. Hopefully you can stay awake. Bullet point number 23. On its own, architecture is nothing but coffins. And today we are building a lot of coffins. I was upset with what was happening to Vancouver, these empty vessels being sold for real estate purposes with nobody living there. So I would walk through the streets and you would just see a dark sky. And I came to Athens and realized that there were so many vacant buildings already, and all these underutilized storefronts could become really wonderful. So I wanted to do a project which showed that there was value to these storefronts. This particular space is now our office, and it's boring. It's a square that is almost perfectly cubed. It's 6 by 7 by 5 meters tall. And we tried to keep from the outside everything that was authentic. For example, even the blue stayed the same. We didn't paint the outside of the building, and ended up injecting this wooden element, which for me, being a Canadian, I love wood, became this kind of like comfort, like a comfort food, but like architectural comfort food for me. Here's one of Melissa's drawings that we collaborated on that shows the ground floor as this collaborative space that we would invite people and do special projects, and upstairs, which is the architectural space that we do our work, that's right now taken over by 2 small little practices. Point number 93. There is beauty and there is interesting, and the two are not necessarily the same. During my thesis, I had come to Greece and started looking into a lot of small craftsmen and a lot of workshops, thinking that, my God, why aren't these things more well known? Why aren't these things collaborating with one another? And I decided to do a thesis which was about talking about the potentials of collaboration in Athens, which everybody told me, if you're in Athens, collaboration doesn't exist, like you're crazy. And I almost imagine, I'm like, well, if these small entities are having such a hard time surviving, why not trick people into thinking that they're big entities? So why not provide a system of small spaces, like what do big companies have that small companies don't? They have a print shop, they have an exhibition space, they have all of these different rooms and resources. Why not share those and become both small and big at the same time? This is the interior of our space before we took it over. These materials were from a contractor that he took with him. This is the space after the renovation. And for us, it was about creating a canvas. So with time, it starts absorbing our own mess. This was the original rendering for the space, which was defined by this large wall. And this is the one side of the space, which, unlike the other side, which is all wood, is a little bit more loose and informal. So there's this relationship between something that's very formal and something that's informal. And our practice exists somewhere in between. And we have this incredible curtain that we just like to show off this animation. But it's also very functional because this space up above interacts with the kitchen and the bathroom. So when you have a meeting, you can kind of create its own little private little zone. And this kitchen has become the hearth of the project. It also becomes an island for parties where we can put food and drinks and access it from all directions. I think I'm very close to the end. Let me see. I am. So this is point number 121. And I wanted to end it with a question. And I wanted to ask, how do we make the world more human? Small is beautiful, but small is also ugly. And I wanted to just have us think a little bit about the relationship between scale and where we are today and what we can do in the future.
Thank you, Thanasis. That was brilliant, really interesting. I'd like